Today we'll look at Egypt and Mesopotamia as we look at the key concept 1.3, the development and interactions of early agricultural, pastoral, and urban societies. Now before we begin, it's very important that you keep the basic structure of these basic societies in check because the period 1 foundations unit that you're now going over accounts for only 5% of your multiple choice test. However, it forms the foundation, hence the name, of the rest of the units that will follow because it begins with the major points of interaction with people and societies. The absolute basics on the foundations period are 1.31 and 1.32. One being that there are several core civilization zones that are going to develop in a variety of geographic and environmental settings, and most of those, if not all of those, involve resource development and labor, both of which have only agricultural and flourishment to lead to. So basically what I'm trying to get to is the Neolithic revolution that you've already studied is going to give way to agricultural surplus. And when you have more food, you can have more people. And when you have more people, you start to increase the amount of those bands of foragers that band together in civilizations. And here are the major points of civilizations that you need to know about. Of course, the Mesopotamian and Egyptian ones will be talked about today. Mesopotamia along the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys. Egypt is in the Nile River Valley. Later on, you'll be looking at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa in the Indus River Valley. You'll look at the Shang in the Yellow River or the Huanghe Valley. And then we'll skip across the ocean to the Olmecs in Mesoamerica and the Shavan people in the Indian South American area. So that's the 1.3.I. You got to know those zones, okay? You got to look at them on a map. You have to know where they are. 1.3.2 looks at the states that start to emerge during the growth of those civilization zones, those core zones. And we're going to start with Egypt today. Now, we start with Egypt because Egypt, of all those zones, is probably the most widely understood that you know of. So we're going to start with an easy one. Egypt is the one that is covered in middle school. You probably have covered it in elementary school at some level, or at least you know some of the basics of that. And we look at Egypt as one of the major core zones for several reasons. One, it has tons and tons of agricultural production due to what is called the gift of the Nile. The regular flooding that takes place in this region is extremely important. It's going to be useful for getting all that agricultural grown. Red land versus black land, where you have the regular flooding, which comes from the southern portion in the cataracts, the first and second cataracts in what was called Nubia at the time. That water flows north to the Mediterranean Sea, to the delta. Along the way, it deposits very black, organically rich material of silt, hence black land. And then when that water retreats, you have the land that you can grow on. This flooding was very predictable. It allowed Upper and Lower Egypt to really have a good, wide base of resource material for growing agriculture. Beyond that, this area survives for quite some time due to natural barriers. Of course, you know the Sahara Desert to the west and to the south. There are mountains also along the way of the river which protect it from invasion. To the east, the Sinai Peninsula has a small strip of land that, as long as it's looked at and addressed with security, can be protected against. To the north, you have the Mediterranean Sea, so that's kind of hard unless you have a navy, and if you have a small navy, you can protect that pretty well. And then, of course, the Red Sea is another little barrier. So natural barriers, a lot of it in protection for invasion, and of course, invasion will be the name of the game for the Egyptians during some of their kingdoms, due to the fact that they do have such a large-scale amount of natural resources. It goes beyond stuff like agriculture. There are other goods that are being produced here or being traded with. The expansion of trade is really important when it comes to economics as one of your major themes for this year. Economics, right? Spice, the E. Economics is going to be extremely important, and you start looking at trade becoming important for building civilizations into eventually what we will call some of them in Unit 2 empires. Okay, so look at trade. Trade will lead to money. Money, growth, and power, unfortunately, also leads to stuff like war and conquest, whether it's for that territory or whether that territory is starting to expand outward. So let's talk about government and administration. This is 1.3.2.a. You have to look at new states becoming powerful, and those new states have new systems of rule. Most of that rule is allowed to take place because, once again, surplus labor and surplus resources over a large area can be controlled, and somebody has to do the controlling. And so that administrative system is what's going to allow for organized development of kingdoms and civilizations to flourish. Now, a lot of these early states are often led by a ruler who is divine or believed to be divine. That kind of divinity gives that ruler a little bit more of an extra edge versus any other normal organized person who could say, I can organize these resources as well. And then, of course, military has to be supporting this ruler. There are countless examples throughout any of these time periods and any of these studies points that we will look at where sometimes the military does not support a ruler, and therefore that ruler is quickly removed through force, of course. We have a whole formal name for that process. Later on, when we get into the other time periods, it becomes a fact of history that sometimes the military takes matters into their own hands and removes a leader by force. For now, for the most part, we're going to look at the positive side of this, where leaders in the early states need to have that support of the military. For Egypt, you look at central administration. This is in the capital city. Egypt is very unique in that it has many capital cities over the course of the kingdoms, because it was such a long period of kingdoms, and you went through several dynasties, that sometimes those dynasties up and move the capital city into different areas, different cities. And so Egypt has a wide expanse there of different cities. Here in America, we have one capital city, Washington, D.C. We're a young country, though. We're a young power, so that has not changed very much. Maybe Philadelphia as the early center of power, and then, of course, the capital of Washington later on down the road. So at the most, we have two major central administration areas in our history. Egypt has more, so they have half a dozen to even a dozen if you look at certain examples of cities that are built and constructed as the central administration. They develop in Egypt the governmental agency known as a bureaucracy. Bureaucracies are very important because this is the actual organization of any government. So when you start seeing the term bureaucracy, you're basically trying to get a fancy term for the government style and organization that these powers to be are keeping track of. And they have to be organized because now you're talking full-fledged organized civilizations, keeping track of land, people, tax dollars coming in, labor that's being shipped out for capital works projects, monumental buildings, which we'll talk about here in a minute. That labor needs to be able to collect goods for the capital, or temples for the religious side. Monuments are a very big part of 1.3 that we'll talk about later. Architecture, all that stuff you need goods for. And so we know Egypt has tons of resources, both natural and collected, so that stuff is going to have to be organized and kept under control. Now, if a central power is strong, bureaucrats typically are chosen by merit, and vice versa. If central powers are weak, those offices sometimes are weaker, and so often they are chosen by hereditary means through families, and they gain, through family control, more dynastic, autonomous power. So start making a distinction here when you start looking at politics over time at bureaucracies. You have to tie together social and political stuff when you look at those themes, and one of the easiest ways to do that is to look at power. How is power situated within a government, and how is that power illustrative of whether the government, and therefore the country, is strong or weak? If it's strong, typically that's because you have strong leaders. They're smart, they're intelligent, they know what they're doing, they get to where they are because of what they know and how they carry themselves. If they're weaker, you may have a chance of examples there where it's a family line and the dad might have been really, really good at his job and been awesome, but the son that comes after him or the grandson that comes after him maybe are just collecting on the laurels, so to speak, of what dad or granddad did. So, as we move forward, we organize Egypt into kingdoms, and there's two major ones. There's the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is around 2700 BC. Most historians will use that as a little threshold there, and it'll go to 2200 BC. So, that happens when a ruler by the name of Menes, he will combine Upper and Lower Egypt. These were two separate little zones of power, loosely connected through trade, but nothing else really, maybe culture. And then this gentleman by the name of Menes will use his military and actually take over and collectivize Upper and Lower Egypt to create one massive empire. And then he will start the first dynasty, where he will be in charge as a pharaoh, and then his son will be in charge when he dies, and so forth. That's what a dynasty is. The pharaoh at this point is seen as a god, a living god, absolute power. We go through absolute power in every single region that we talk about in this course. Every single region, whether it's Europe, Africa, Middle East, Asia, Southeast Asia, Americas, South, North, Central, wherever. You look at a zone and you look at power. At some point, that power featured absolute rule, absolute power, where somebody controls absolutely through some kind of rigid type of leadership. He will develop the first bureaucracy because he has that absolute power. He has to keep everything organized. With that, he's got representatives. It's nothing that's atypical of a lot of organized, complex government systems. His main representative at the time is known as the vizier. So if you see that term, you can start narrowing your focus down to, vizier, that means it's Egypt, that kind of deal. Look for the key terms. That's why we give you Quizlet terms and stuff. You've got to look for the nuts and bolts of this course. And then, of course, Menes has 42 departments with governors for each of these departments. Kind of similar to how a government today in America has a cabinet, right? The president has a cabinet. There's a bunch of different departments there, housing, agriculture, education, all that kind of stuff. And all those people that are leading those things will give the pharaoh advice on how to do certain areas or certain laws or whatever. 1.3.3, Roman numeral 3, looks at culture. Culture is huge for this class because it's a wide umbrella. Myself and other teachers will say that culture is a very large umbrella. It covers a lot of things. Even in 1.3.3, if you read the language of the key concept, look at what it can fall under the umbrella of culture. Significant role in unifying states through things like law, language, literature, religion, myths, and monumental art. And even art can be broken down into stuff like music, eventually stuff that you see, propaganda, that falls into a couple of these things. So look at culture. What is a culture? What do we share when we talk about common culture? You share things like law, language, customs, literature, religion, myths, and art, stuff like that you hold dear. 1.3.3.a therefore is going to be breaking off of that culture, and this particular one, A, looks at early civilizations developing monumental architecture and urban planning. One of the things that a government has to organize is labor and resources. Oftentimes that labor and resources is used to transform the country or the area or whatever territory you're talking about through things of urban planning, the growth of the urban planning system. Cities, right? Look at Jacksonville, for example. When something happens in Jacksonville to benefit everybody, that's called urban planning. It may be a road being built or increased in size in order to make more flow. It may be a bridge that goes over a different body of water that allows transportation to flow. It could be the building of a new hospital where there is not good coverage. Same thing with police stations, fire stations. You could talk about schooling as a great one. We have lots of schools here. Those things have been built over time to service the need of growing population centers. In Egypt, the easiest easiest one for urban planning to talk about are pyramids. Because you've already seen, hopefully, some representation of the pyramid system in Egypt. So we use that as our no-brainer softball layup type of example here. The pyramids, of course, are built for a pharaoh's burial. Sometimes they'll be started during the beginning of the reign of a pharaoh, and then, of course, they might not even be completed until well after the pharaoh's death. In some cases, their families, their servants also go in those pyramids as well. And so that starts looking at culture and what you're putting a basis for religion around as well. Oftentimes they're filled with goods that'll be needed by the Ka, the spirit of the person in the afterlife, the spirits of all the people that are in this pyramid in the afterlife. These are big tombs, right? So look at a tomb. What would a spirit world tomb need to service a person for the afterlife? Chariots, food, weapons, dogs. That's why we put servants in there. They're mummified as well, families. Mummification is the system the Egyptians used to preserve bodies for that dead. They remove the organs. They wrap them up in tight cotton linen, which is very clean. They spray the bodies with perfume and such to help with that process. All these things indicate some kind of cultural significance here. And like I said, this all dives back into using the pyramids as a method of monumental architecture. They still exist today. That's pretty awesome considering this is several thousands of years after most of them were built and constructed. Giza is your great example here. One of your kings, King Khufu, built the Great Pyramid, which is the typical picture postcard example of the pyramid system in Egypt. You also have the Sphinx as well, which is the head of a body of man, the body of a lion, that kind of stuff. It's changed a little bit over time as erosion and stuff have gotten to it. However, we still hold these things in awe. Historians, in some cases, still debate how this thing was constructed using the primitive technologies that were there several thousands of years ago. It would have taken an extremely immense, organized system to put some of these things together with such detail where, modern day builders take, precise tools and methods to do. Then you have the Middle Kingdom, which is between the Old and the New Kingdom, 2050 to 1652 BC, give or take. The image of the pharaoh and that changing political, social persona is really important because we start moving from an absolute, impersonal, godlike figure to somebody who is more a person protector, right? A protector of the actual people, because at some point the pharaoh's role needs to change. As growth occurs and expansion of Egypt occurs, you start taking in more different cultural areas. You start trading with more and more people. Different culture customs are mixed together and intertwined. And some of those cultures don't feel the same way that the Egyptians were feeling in the Old Kingdom. So once again, the pharaoh and his image will change along with that. This is the time where really there's a lot of flourishing with trade because, once again, expansion equals typically more and more movement of trade, long-distance trade. And then new public works projects. You have the Wall of Princes, for example. There's a pyramid for pretty much every pharaoh during this kingdom built. Not so much in the Old Kingdom, but during this kingdom, it was like every pharaoh had to have a pyramid, otherwise they were terrible. Drainage, farmland. You have to keep up with the rise in population, so you have to keep farming and farming and farming. The deltas, with the red land, black land, when they flood, they only go so high. So sometimes you need more and more expansive areas of farmland, and the only way to get that stuff taken care of is to, of course, drain it. And that drainage and that irrigation systems are really easy to look at here in the first two time periods as a really big public works project. When we mention public works projects, you can look for the basic ones like pyramids and ziggurats and all that kind of stuff. But look at irrigation, because without farmland, we don't have people, and without people, we don't build these great kingdoms. Society here, when you look at society, the pharaoh at the top, no-brainer. The royal family with him, right underneath. A group of nobles and priests, the high priests and nobles that are in this area, take stance right below the pharaoh. That's a pretty common trait served along a lot of social pyramids that we will cover in this course over the course of the next 100 and so odd days. So make sure you typically understand that process. Middle class, that contains the lower officials, merchants, artisans, scribes, tax collectors. In some cases, in some other societies or some other time periods, some of these people are not in the middle class. They're in the lower class. In Egypt, they're in the middle class. Who is in the lower class then? Peasants, okay? Peasants. And of course, below them, you probably had some form of slave or prisoner of war that was not, useful for the rest of society. Women. I want to talk about women because I say it in my class all the time. When you start doing essays and studying and social breakdowns, it's really important that if need be, you always be able to talk about women, the role of women, where their status is, what they can do, what they can't do. That's a really easy one to use on essays and things of that nature if you get into a pinch or a bind. And so in this case, in Egypt, during this kingdom as we build it, women, they can hold, inherit, and will property. And they can regain a dowry in a divorce. Those are 2-3 major things that can be useful for you when looking at women in this society, because that will not always be the case in other societies. To hold, inherit, and will property, and to regain a dowry, which is the payment paid for a woman in order for a marriage to occur, those are big deals. Those are big deals that we won't see in a lot of other societies. Moving on, we're going to go to 1.3.3.b, elites, both political and religious, right? So you're talking about your priests and your pharaohs here. Sometimes it's not a pharaoh, it's a king or whoever. They promote arts and artisanship. And they do this sometimes through public work projects. Sometimes they do this through, arts like writing. Writing is extremely important. Why do we talk about those 5, 6, 7 zones that I mentioned earlier in the earlier slide that we broke down? We talk about those zones and those zones only for one reason. We have records for them. Were there people that were probably around in the world prior to the Egyptians? Yeah. Were there groups of people that were collected together and doing things that we talk about the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians and the Shang doing and the Shavans? Of course there probably were. But we don't have records of what those things are because they didn't write them down. They didn't use any kind of language to do that. The Egyptians did. The Mesopotamians did, and so forth. So, key term for you, hieroglyphics. You know what hieroglyphics are. That's the writing system that was used by the Egyptians, illustrated in this slide to the left, where you have symbols meaning letters putting together vertically from north to south. That would be what we use to look at. And we only have this script for doing this because in the 1800s, Napoleon, on one of his campaigns in North Africa, dug up or found, or his soldiers found, what's known as the Rosetta Stone. And the Rosetta Stone had 3 basic languages on it. One was ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, one was ancient Greek, and one was, I think it was Latin. And so once we didn't understand what, hieroglyphics meant, and we didn't understand what, ancient Greek was, but we knew what Latin was. And so Latin was used to translate Greek, which was used to translate the hieroglyphics one. So we got a really good tool there, always useful to write things down and have some kind of cipher for that. That's what we used to do Egyptian writing for the most part. And used hierarchic script for everyday writing. So record keeping, stuff like that. This is how we organize writing, and we don't go north to south anymore. In most places, we go right to left or left to right, depending on what culture you live in. Looking at systems of record keeping, those things are going to arise independently in all early civilizations and subsequently were diffused. 1.3.3.c. And an easy way to tie this into this particular deal is religion. If you look at part B, it looks at art and artisanship through writing and through symbols and that kind of stuff. Part C, in the same actual vein, looks at religion, because record keeping in most cases arises with several books that we have. Most commonly, the Book of the Dead for the Egyptians is a really good resource and one of the classic examples that AP will expect you to know that contains ideas about the Egyptian religion. What do we know about the Egyptian religion? Really simplistic, polytheistic, which means multiple gods. You have a couple of major heavy hitter gods like Re or Ra, typically the sun god, whatever the name is for that sun god. Osiris, you have the underworld god, you have a heaven and a hell, so to speak. And so you have lesser gods, your city gods, for example, that certain towns hold patronage to. I mean, if nothing else, look at old Greek and Roman mythology that you probably already know about as well. For every Zeus, there's a Ra. For every, Hades, there's an Osiris. City gods, you've got Athena and Poseidon being patronaged in the Greek world in different towns, that kind of stuff. But whatever you're doing, the emphasis here is on the next world. That's why those pyramids are put under so much heavy building processes, because those are the tombs that will serve as the next world liaison for these rulers. Mummification was done at a painstakingly major effort, because that body had to be preserved for the spirit to inhabit it in the afterlife. Those tombs were ornately decorated. They had several rooms where you could sleep and go to the bathroom and eat and have little, afterlife parties and whatnot. Those things all show that records for keeping these things around look at culture and being diffused here. Okay, what is it important about a process for burial that we need to write down in a whole book, right? The Book of the Dead. What are the processes for doing that? Why do I care that we took out all of our organs and, wrapped the body in linen and then put certain oils on certain parts of the body and then buried in a certain way and had all these things? Well, that's important because it shows what we value. And in this case, the Egyptians valued next world living. You're only on the earth for so many years, right? The life expectancy of Egyptians were very small compared to today's standards. So much more time will be spent by your spirit and body in the afterworld. Record keeping shows sometimes what we put emphasis on. Here's one example of that. Before we move on to Mesopotamia, lasting developments and impressions of the Egyptian people, several things that we look at the Egyptians as being the, forebearers for. The 365-day calendar, as an example, which will be used by several people down the road. Geometry, right? Looking at certain things of mathematics. We know that pyramids and all those structures and building irrigation canals and stuff takes a lot of math and engineering, and they start that process. We know that taking care of a dead body is really important for them in the afterlife, for religion and social, cultural type of understanding. That takes something called embalming, where you preserve tissue. That process has begun here. Transporting and building, transportation, boats on canals are used to transport large, heavy stone from quarries up to where these pyramids are being built. The pyramids themselves, how are they built? It's a really intricate process you can look up examples about and see that this is not an easy process. It takes a lot of time and organization to do, and therefore that goes to show different ways that these societies are managing their labor. And of course, medical practices, stuff like anatomy, chemistry. You had to know where the heart was in order to remove it, to take care of it for the afterlife, or the brain, or what the liver was for, and what different parts of the body were for. If you got sick, we're not just you get sick, you're dead. Sometimes that did happen, but in some places you can use medicine to deal with that. Chemistry, same way. We have examples of perfumes and salts and stuff that were combined to make things that helped the embalming process, the burial process, be a little bit more able to handle. So now we're going to move on to Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, as you can see in that diagram to the top right corner, is located in the Middle East, modern-day Middle East area, in between Asia Minor or Turkey and the Persian Gulf. You got the Tigris and Euphrates River, which would be around Iran, Iraq area. The Fertile Crescent is what this is called, because it kind of curves around like a crescent moon there. Two distinct river valleys that ran largely parallel to each other. Not much rain in this region. It's a little bit of a deserty type of region. However, once again, flooding of those two rivers was pretty predictable. And so it's not just one river with a delta like the Egyptian area was. There you can see in the bottom left, this area had two rivers, and so that kind of creates a parallel zone of agriculture. You live in the middle of it, you're good to go. You got food on both sides. You live on one side of it only, that's still fine because now you have all this access to food and land. Lots of water is needed to supply the areas in between and outside this area, and so that once again equals irrigation, and irrigation once again equals an organized government system, and that starts to occur right around the time of 3000 BCE. Your first organized civilization here are the Sumerians. Right around 5000 to 2000 BCE is when their kind of heyday is. They developed these things called city-states. It's not one massive collective kingdom. It's a bunch of different little kingdoms that share some trade, they share some laws possibly, but they are still disconnected for some, for some reason. They are usually interdependent, which means they kind of depend on each other for the stuff like resources, but at the same time they kind of are saying, hey, we're on our own as well. Kind of like AP World. There are 4 of us that teach this class. We are interdependent on one another. We work together. However, we are still different. I teach my class differently than Ms. Rodriguez teaches her class, or Mr. Agnew from Mr. Tovey, or vice versa. Agricultural areas plus the city dominate most of these city-states. Right? You have these 2 major rivers, little zones along the river. So what's going to dominate the river? The people that are in this little city-state. Okay? Egyptians have pyramids, basic pyramid structure, right? The Mesopotamian example are called ziggurats. They are more stepped, but they're the same basic structure. Irrigation systems are really important for the Sumerians because that's what they're going to use to irrigate all this land. Political power, how do we do that? That's held in the temples. Landholders having power. That is a really important idea. For the most part, when you start looking at culture and politics and the way societies are run or interacted, you have to control some kind of resource to have power. The easiest resource that is controlled by people that have power throughout this course is land. And so that land oftentimes gives people power because what's grown on the land, what's taken from the land, stuff like that. In some cases, like for the Sumerians, these people that are landholders or work in the temples, they hold power before royalty will hold power. And of course, you do have your lugals in the palaces, your leader. Lugal is the term for leader. So you have that as well. So you kind of have like a double system here in the Sumerian world working. 1.3.2.b looks at growth and competition of states for land and resources. The more favorably situated had greater access to things like resources, and therefore they can produce more food surplus, which means they can grow their populations. So in the course of the Mesopotamian world, you got several basic bodies of people that are going to be occurring over time in this first period. The Kassites, the Assyrians are a good example that we'll look at later. The Hittites are a good example for several reasons. All 3 of these and some other ones are going to spread Mesopotamian culture throughout Western Asia. Okay, Southwestern Asia to be more specific. So when you start looking at these 3, they're going to be important because they are very aggressive when it comes to conquest and trade. And that aggressiveness when it comes to conquest and trade also leads to the spread of stuff like culture. And they are going to able, with that spread, that expansion, that aggressiveness, to not only undertake territorial expansion, but they're going to try to conquer the surrounding states. Sometimes that brings Mesopotamia in direct conflict with places like Egypt, for example. And so that is a relationship that is going to be shared. If you look at the picture from the previous slide later on, you can tell they're not too far away from each other. They don't know each other exist, and there is some overlap in time. Trade, super important. First, widespread networks of trade start small scale, go to medium, then go to long distance. The Syrian-Palestine trade for Mesopotamia, for example, is the most important one. Metals are really, really important. The Hittites, for example, had a large iron industry. That iron is going to be useful for building things like chariots and weaponry. That weaponry is going to be used to obviously wage war and expand territories, especially when you start putting it onto new forms of transportation. horses, camels, chariots. The quicker you can move people and goods, the longer distances you can travel, the quicker you can travel. That stuff's going to be really important for expansion, like we talked about with this key concept. Here's a basic map for you of the region of the Arabic zone with Egypt still there. So if you can see it, the little dark zone there that kind of circles the Tigris and Euphrates rivers kind of sweeps around. The Hittites are to the north. There's some of the Egyptian areas there to that map where the delta is. You can see that there along the Fertile Crescent is going to be a lot of connection here with trade that's going to eventually occur. Empires, there are a couple of major ones that will develop over time. The Akkadians in 2350, led by Sargon I. Sargon I has a couple of different things you want to know about. If you do your reading, you can pretty much summarize those things. And then you have Old Babylonia, led, of course, by Hammurabi. We know Hammurabi because he writes a book of code. That law code, that Hammurabi code, is another one of your examples that this unit will expect you to know about, okay, when it comes to literature. They will make sure that you know what is the difference between the Hammurabi's code book and other law giving manuals. His is very strict, it's very rigid. It solidifies social, political, and customary systems over the people by the king. 1.3 Roman numeral 3.c talks about legal code solidifying those three types of systems where a ruler is over the people. Hammurabi's code is a great example of that, and if you look at examples of Hammurabi's code, you will see what kind of rigidity I'm talking about. One of the classic examples we used to teach was Hammurabi's code is the eye for an eye code. You do something that makes somebody lose an eye, if you're found guilty, that's going to mean that your eye typically is taken from you. There are other ones that are kind of weird but are still very direct, like the one where, if a builder builds a house for a family and that house collapses and kills somebody in the family, the builder's son has to die, which is kind of weird, but the video that John Green goes over talks about some of those examples for you. And then, of course, Hammurabi and the Old Babylonians are called the Babylonians because their main capital is the city of Babylon. And this is an example of monumental architecture. Don't go back to 1.3.3.a, looking at monumental architecture being developed by early civilizations, right? Urban planning, architecture. Look at the ziggurats and the way that palaces are built and all that kind of stuff. Here's a really quick and simple little guide for you that shows you kind of the overlap here of different people. This valley, these two valleys, I should say, over thousands of years, go through several ups and downs when it comes to people that are in control. Sumeria is on here, Babylon in the red, the Assyrians in purple to the north. There's some overlap there with the Persians coming around in 525. We'll get to those here shortly with the empires. But you can look at the overlap. Those time periods where people are in charge in different zones can show you there's a loose collection here of these city-states. Economically speaking, you got to talk about long-distance trade being necessary. Eventually, this is really important for this zone because this is going to be the starting point of the Silk Road, which will eventually connect all the way over to China. So the long-distance trade, we know through records, is going to start coming around through bartering and through the merchant class. The merchant class in Mesopotamia will emerge just like it did in the Egyptian world, and you should always look at their status in a society. Some societies value merchants, some societies devalue merchants, and they have reasons for that, socially and politically. Trade here is through bartering. You take a goat is worth, several bags of grain, or it's worth, a sword, that kind of deal. You barter. You don't have coins. They have started to find more and more evidence of early coin trade coming from the Indus River Valley outward, but that won't come for some time. Don't forget the roots of the trading process. It's through trade of goods. Society breakdowns here, looking at free land owners. Free land through the royalty and the priests. And then they'll become dependent on farmers and artisans. That's when your middle class will appear, right? When people that are working at land have more power and authority to do stuff, that's when you start seeing growth of a middle class. At the very bottom, once again, you have slaves, prisoners of war, through all that conquering that's taking place. And look at women, declining status. So if you had to look at a comparison between Egypt and Mesopotamia, hopefully you can see Egypt typically more positive towards women, Mesopotamia typically more low towards women, declining status. They can own property, and they can trade, and they can control the dowry, but sometimes those things are different than the Egyptian world. Sometimes they're not. So look at that. 1.3.3.e looks at new religious belief systems developing in this period, and they have strong influences in later periods. Religiously speaking, they're polytheistic as well. Over 3,000 accounted gods and goddesses in the Mesopotamian world. Many of them are, associated with priesthoods that are built around that. Hereditary priesthoods through families, right? And most of them represent some form of nature. That nature has to be looked at and observed, just like it was in the Egyptian world, in order to be appeased. If something wasn't going right with a harvest, what's to blame? Well, it's probably because you made the water god angry, and so you're not getting as much water or something. So you have to do something to make that god happy. Okay? Humans are created as servants to the gods is the overall underlying principle of the Mesopotamian world. That means that typically there's a negative outlook between the environment of people and the gods. What did we do wrong type of deal, right? What did I do wrong? That's a very pessimistic view. A lot of those views are contained in another one of the most important works that you'll have to know about in this unit, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Your video for John Green talks a little bit about that. It has a little thing about it and what it's about, but basically we anger the gods. The gods create this giant flood, similar to the flood that Christianity holds true with Noah, and it wipes out a lot of people, and eventually we have to make the gods happy again, and we have to make them feel good. Technology and writing, going back to stuff like literature and all that kind of whatnot. How do we write things down? How do we keep a hold of different records, right? Look at part C, look at record keeping. This is through cuneiform. If you see the term cuneiform, you all know automatically, or should know automatically, that's Mesopotamia. Transportation here, boats, barges, and donkeys. Use of pack animals now needs to be discussed. Kind of like a lasting legacy type of deal. So really quickly, you got the number system based on the term 60. You've got different metalwork. Talked about Hittite iron. Now we're talking about bronze being useful. Artisans are part of the merchant middle class, right? So you have different breakdowns there, like the pottery that is being created on a potter's wheel. Those things are being created here in Mesopotamia. Geometry, very similar to what is being used in Egypt, because different things require math, so you got to learn that. And then you have a lunar calendar, which will later on kind of go with the 365-day calendar and kind of get merged together. And of course, astronomy, multiple gods, where the gods live. For the most part, they live in the heavens, in the sky, right? So they'll be able to look at and interpret what's going on in the world above our own. That's astronomy, the birth of astronomy. Finally here, not finally, but we're going to get to the Assyrians here. It's kind of like our starting to be done with this. In northern Mesopotamia, these are your heavy hitters, 9th century BCE, further on along in time, right? Look at trade, 1.3.3.f. Trade expansion in this period, starting in regional and trans-regional, with civilizations exchanging goods, cultural ideas, and technology. Trade is super important, starting off with small scale, going to big scale. It's really important you know what the term trans-regional means. We had an essay a couple years back, and kids bombed it because they didn't know what the term trans-regional meant. So make sure you look it up if you don't already know it. Overlapping trade with the Egyptians, for example, is important because it looks at the large-scale systems of trade happening in this region and in this time period. And this is what I'm talking about. If you look at the overlapping time here, this is only about 200 years, give or take, of the Assyrian Empire. But those borders move, and sometimes those borders will clash or overlap with the Egyptian borders. And so once again, trade, expanding, growing, contracting, whatever, really important as it starts to illustrate the growth of money and power through money and selling goods and whatnot. A couple other ones here on politics. The king is chosen by the gods. It's not a dynastic system where the pharaoh is God, a living God. These kings are chosen by gods. That means that they have both religious and secular duties, right? So you're expanding religion and politics, kind of combining them. And they will use propaganda to make sure that they are recognized as the person who is in control of both religion and secular duties. Specialized troops, a lot of iron means you can have a lot of weapons. Those weapons are fashioned into specialized units in the military, and that's what's going to be used by the people like the Hittites and the Assyrians, for example, to create these large armies who use terror tactics and deportation to get their messages across as they start to expand. With most empires, eventually they expand beyond their control, and when they get too big, those areas are hard to keep under control, and therefore they start to collapse and go into chaos. Officials here will try at first to do things like collecting taxes and maintaining order, raising troops through conscription or some kind of draft process, and of course construct and maintain public works. Roads are an important one, no-brainer. Irrigation canals, other buildings, etc. Eventually those things, though, are not good at being controlled, and therefore, once again, chaos. 1.3 Roman numeral 3.g looks at social and gender hierarchies. Once again, look at the pyramid structure of a social class discussion. You can look at social and gender as the really easy ones here. You have free people, you've got landowning citizens here in the Assyrian world, you've got your farmers and your artisans in the middle, and then eventually you've got your slave classes towards the bottom. This is a very architectural economy, but there are also merchants, and those merchants have to flow somewhere in this social pyramid. And then at the end, those pyramid structure hierarchical breakdowns are solidified, we know, through different collections of texts that occurred when the Mesopotamians built libraries. This is really important because 1.3.3.h looks at literature being a reflection of overall cultural attributes. Once again, go back to your other examples. What does the Epic of Gilgamesh teach us? It teaches us that we need to be, appeasing to the gods. That means we had multiple gods. What does the Book of the Dead teach us? It teaches us that the body needs to be prepared because it has a very short life expectancy, but in the afterlife, it's going to live for much longer. The spirit, right? So we got to make sure we take care of it in order to, make that afterlife awesome. Mesopotamian world, we know we have free people and landowning citizens in this breakdown because it's told to us in text. Conquest here, I think this is your last slide. Eventually, the Assyrians, through that map that you just saw a couple of slides back, are going to expand and move outward. They're going to take over and control Israel. It creates the very first diaspora that this course will look at, the Israeli diaspora. The Phoenicians to the northwest will start to maintain and order trade, and they will colonize areas outside of this region. Then, of course, the Assyrians will take control of Egypt over time, at least for a little bit. They'll conquer Babylonia. They can't keep that control forever, however, because the borders are too wide. So eventually you have other groups taking out the Assyrians. Those were the Medes people. And then, of course, Neo-Babylonians will take out the Medes. And basically you have a process where you have constant upheaval and overthrow and chaos that will eventually lead us to time period 2 when we start looking at empires. And the Persians more often are the great example of takeover points there. So that concludes for today your breakdown of 1.3 with urban societies in your early agricultural worlds in the places of Egypt and Mesopotamia.